Hey guys, this is my first video for my channel, so thank you for tuning in. I'll be going over some key events during the week with a bit of a historical take on each event and explore key political themes and motives, whether it's geopolitics, domestic relations, or foreign policy altogether. So if you enjoy a different take on events with some historical backing, you'll really enjoy my channel. For all you Middle Ground fans, don't worry. Alan and I will still be doing our podcasts on the weekend. It's just been tough figuring out logistics since we live a couple hours away from each other, but we'll make it work this weekend and finally get our first episode recorded. So let's get down to some business, though. Yesterday, the Senate failed to override Trump's resolutions on blocking Saudi arms sales. So this is one of those issues where many Republicans actually voted against Trump in both the House and the Senate. I'm actually with Trump on this one. I'll explain why and break it down into detail. This controversy stems obviously from Khashoggi a little bit, but mostly it's because of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, where there have been reported over 8,000 civilian fatalities according to ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. So if you didn't know, the Saudis have been at war with the Houthis in northern Yemen since 2015. They entered that war for various reasons, and I'll get into them. The war has been going on since 2004. The Houthis can be best described as an Iranian-backed insurgency against the Republican government, which in turn is obviously backed by the Saudis. So this all stems from the government's attempt to arrest Hussein Badreddin al-Houthi in 2004. Houthi was a Zaidi religious, political, military leader with a lot of influence in northern Yemen, which to us is basically western Yemen if you look at the map. It borders Saudi Arabia. But before we dive into Houthi, it's just important to know Yemen used to be two countries. It was South Yemen, and then it was also known as the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen. So as you could surmise, it was a communist country backed by the Soviet Union. And once the USSR collapsed, South Yemen was unified with the Yemen Arab Republic. So that was the northern Yemen area. And before that occurred, the Yemen Arab Republic basically came about because the Egyptian president Gamal Nasser, if you recall, the Pan-Arab movement of the 1950s and 60s, which basically promoted Arab countries to, basically come together and join almost like a super country, or at least like a super economic trade deal. But anyway, he kind of foisted his influence onto this area and created the Yemen Arab Republic out of northern Yemen. He basically backed the paramilitary force and revolutionaries there in 1962 against the Saudi-backed Yemeni government. And civil war broke out, but ultimately Saudi Arabia recognized the Yemen Republic in 1970, which was northern Yemen, like I said. So just remember, south was communist and the north was the Nasser-backed republic. But ultimately, once the USSR dissolved, they came together and unified as one country in 1990. And as you can imagine, it hasn't been really smooth sailing since then. During this time, Houthi was really gaining popularity and set up his own political party called the Believing Youth Movement, which taught young people about Zaidi, which is a Shia sect of Islam. Approximately 50% of Yemen is this Zaidi Shia religion. So if you recall too that Saudi Arabia is Sunni, so these directly conflict with one another. So ultimately, this movement, this youth movement, kind of morphed into a paramilitary force that was extremely anti-American and extremely anti-Saudi. They just simply felt that the Yemeni government was too closely tied to the United States and to Saudi Arabia as well. So in June of 2004, the Yemeni government actually decided to try to arrest Houthi, and finally they got to 640 of his followers and got them arrested, but they offered a bounty of 55K to capture Houthi. By July of 2004, tensions rose even further, and the government forces killed 25 of his supporters and increased the bounty to 75,500. But then ultimately, the government got him and killed him in action, along with 20 of his closest aides in the Moran district, which was his hometown area. It borders Saudi Arabia in northern Yemen. So ever since then, the Houthis have garnered support from Iran, and they ultimately took over the entire region in 2014, which was northern Yemen again. So Saudi Arabia then entered the fray in 2015 in support of the government. So just from this perspective alone, you can see why it matters that we support a Saudi Arabian-led coalition in Yemen. Essentially, you have this pro-Iranian insurgency that is located right on the Horn of Africa in the Gulf of Aden. So think about all the oil and shipping that flows right by northern Yemen. It's billions of dollars worth of cargo that goes right by them. The Suez Dam is located right there, so all the shipping from Europe down to China and Asia has to go right by there. So, the Suez Canal alone, it allows for 43% of reduction of travel. So it's a key area. So many countries rely on this area and need it safe for travel. So, just think about it. You have Korea, Japan, India, the whole EU, and that's why the U.S. needs to ensure that, this is a safe place to travel by. So, for that reason, we can't have an anti-American junta controlling our allies' main economic artery. So Trump, I think, is correct in assessing the long-term effect of supporting KSA, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We have a long history with the KSA, starting with the Standard Oil Company of California. It later became Aramco, or the Arabian American Oil Company. The American company received the first concessions for oil in Saudi Arabia at the time, and ultimately we brokered a 50-50 agreement with them, meaning they got 50% of the profit. So very good, generous offer at the time by the Americans. But the problem was Iran was looking, and they saw that we offered a 50-50 agreement to the Saudis. So they went to BP and to England, and they said, hey, the Americans gave a 50-50 agreement to the Saudis. Can you do the same thing? And can you guess what the British said? No. So they were in debt after World War II, and they couldn't afford to lose any more profits from BP. So they declined the request. And Mossadegh, at the time, he was the leader of Iran. He just nationalized the oil fields and basically stole them. So the British came to the CIA and to the U.S. and said, hey, can you overthrow Mossadegh, install the Shah? Later on, you have the Iranian hostage crisis as a result. So that basically went awry. So anyway, back to Saudi Arabia. We helped them set up an oil pipeline in 1950. We basically have always had a good relationship with them due to our shared opposition of communism, support of stable oil prices, stable oil fields, protection of oil shipping in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and just overall stability of Western economies, because they're heavily invested in the U.S. and in Europe. So they kind of have a stake in us doing well, right? So, contemporarily, though, since the 2000s, Saudi Arabia and the U.S. haven't really had the best of relations. They were against the invasion of Iraq, so they didn't get along with Bush. Obama wasn't very good with them either, but Trump has been working towards kind of improving our relationship ever since his visit in May of 2017. And obviously, people will criticize Trump for aiding the KSA because Khashoggi's death and the deaths of civilians in Yemen. But the reality is it's the lesser of two evils in the Middle East. There's going to be, lots of murders, lots of corruption, and at least with this one, we have a reciprocal history with Saudi Arabia. So, I'd prefer to have a good relationship with them than any other country in the region, especially since they recognize Israel as well. So, back to the actual vote in Congress. it takes 2/3 vote in each chamber to veto, to overturn a veto. So, in the House, they had around like 77 percentile, but they fell short in the Senate. And the history of the veto, uh, it actually means "I forbid" in Latin. The first real big veto was from Andrew Jackson when he vetoed the recharter of the Bank of the United States, or BUS as it's known. I could talk about that for days. Actually, we could do another video on that. But anyhow, we'll continue to talk about Trump and Saudi Arabia. So, you know, Congress was unable to collect the votes to override Trump's veto. So this will allow Trump to continue with the pending 8.1 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and some other smaller nations that are involved. But just keep in mind, this is good business. If it wasn't Trump who's going to sell to the Saudis, someone else would. It would be China or Russia, and that wouldn't be good either. So, overall, I think this is a good play by Trump, and he really is going to keep the region in good blight with the Americans. So, moving forward, we just have to continue to trade information with the Saudis. Trade obviously goods and resources, and we'll see what happens in Yemen. Hopefully they can remain one country, but if they want to be two, it could be a two-state solution, kind of like in Israel. But we'll see what happens. But overall, good play by Trump. And thank you for watching my first video. I hope to come out with a few more in the near future.